You feel your heart racing during that crucial presentation, watching your carefully prepared words dissolve into nervous stammering, while colleagues judge your every mistake. Every workplace setback sends your emotions spiraling, turning minor criticism into sleepless nights and transforming routine stress into overwhelming anxiety that follows you home, poisoning your relationships and stealing your peace. I am Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor who maintained inner tranquility, while bearing the crushing weight of ruling the vast Roman Empire during plagues, wars, and endless political turmoil. For nearly 2 decades, I developed unshakable emotional mastery through Stoic principles, learning to govern my inner world even more effectively than I governed Rome itself. What I discovered about controlling emotions will transform how you respond to every challenge life throws at you, giving you the mental fortress that no external circumstance can breach. The same philosophy that sustained emperors through the darkest times can sustain anyone facing modern stress and emotional turbulence. But first, like this video, subscribe for more Stoic wisdom, and comment where you're watching from. I want to see how far the need for emotional mastery has spread across our world. I never wanted to be emperor. When Antoninus Pius adopted me at the age of 17, I thought my life would be devoted to philosophy and quiet contemplation. I dreamed of studying in Athens, debating with the great minds of my time, living a life of intellectual pursuit rather than political burden. But fate, as I would later learn, cares nothing for our personal desires. The morning I received word that Antoninus had died, I was in my villa outside Rome, reading Epictetus and preparing lectures on Stoic philosophy. The messenger arrived before dawn, his horse lathered with sweat, bearing the purple cloak that would become both my crown and my chain. As I lifted that heavy fabric, feeling its weight in my hands, I understood for the first time that 60 million lives now depended on my decisions. My first emotional test came within hours. The Praetorian Guard demanded an immediate bonus for their loyalty. Senators whispered about succession challenges, and urgent messages poured in from every corner of the empire. I felt my heart racing, my breath shortening, my mind spinning with the impossibility of the task before me. How could one man carry such responsibility? How could I make decisions that would affect more people than I could ever meet or understand? That first night as emperor, I didn't sleep. I paced my chambers, consumed by anxiety about every choice I would have to make. Should I increase grain subsidies for the masses? How should I respond to barbarian raids on the frontier? What about the growing Christian movement that threatened traditional Roman values? Each decision felt massive, each choice pregnant with consequences I couldn't foresee. But it was in that sleepless darkness that I made my first crucial discovery about emotional control. As I sat with my fear and overwhelm, I began to observe these feelings rather than be consumed by them. I noticed how my anxiety created scenarios that might never happen, how my worry about future decisions prevented me from thinking clearly about present ones. I remembered the teachings of Epictetus, who had been a slave before becoming a philosopher. If he could maintain inner freedom while his body belonged to another, surely I could maintain inner peace while my time belonged to Rome. I began to see that my greatest enemy wasn't external threats to the empire, but internal threats to my equanimity. 3 weeks into my reign, news arrived that shattered any illusions I had about the luxury of emotional indulgence. Germanic tribes had crossed the Danube in unprecedented numbers, slaughtering entire Roman settlements. The reports described women and children murdered, cities burned, survivors fleeing south in terror. My generals demanded immediate military response, but the treasury was strained, the legions were scattered, and any decision I made would determine whether thousands more lived or died. I felt rage rising in my chest, rage at the barbarians for their brutality, Rage at my predecessor for leaving me this crisis. Rage at fate for forcing this burden upon me. But then I noticed something remarkable happening. As I observed my anger without immediately acting on it, I began to see more clearly. The emotion was information, not instruction. My rage told me this situation mattered deeply, but it didn't tell me what to do about it. That was when I learned the first great lesson of emotional mastery. Your feelings are valid, but they are not your master. They can inform your decisions, but they cannot make your decisions. An emperor who rules from emotion rules poorly, and an empire ruled by one man's unchecked feelings becomes the graveyard of millions. The second year of my reign brought a crisis that would test everything I thought I knew about leadership and emotional control. A plague swept across the empire, carried by soldiers returning from campaigns in the east. It began in the ports and spread like wildfire through every major city. The symptoms were horrific fever, skin lesions, violent coughing that produced blood. Within days of infection, strong men became corpses. I had read about plagues in historical accounts, but nothing prepared me for the reality of watching an empire slowly die. Every morning brought reports of new casualties, new cities affected, new regions where normal life had completely collapsed. Trade ceased, harvests rotted in fields, and fear consumed even those who remained healthy. My physician, Galen, had served my predecessor and was considered the finest medical mind in the empire. I watched him work tirelessly among the sick, studying symptoms, testing treatments, maintaining meticulous records, even as death surrounded him daily. What struck me most was his emotional composure. While others panicked, while senators fled Rome, while citizens rioted in the streets demanding divine intervention, Galen remained calm and methodical. One evening, after he had spent 14 hours treating patients in the city's poorest districts, I asked him how he maintained such steadiness amid such horror. His answer changed my understanding of emotional control forever. "Caesar," he said, his hands still stained with the blood of patients he couldn't save. "Emotions spread faster than any disease. When I show fear, my patients become more afraid, and fear weakens their body's ability to fight the sickness. When I show despair, families lose hope, and hope is often the difference between recovery and death. My emotional state becomes part of my treatment." I began observing this phenomenon throughout the empire. In cities where governors maintained calm authority, citizens organized effective responses, caring for the sick, maintaining food distribution, preserving order. In regions where leaders succumbed to panic, chaos multiplied the plague's damage. Fear became a second epidemic, more contagious than the disease itself. This taught me that, as emperor, my emotional reactions didn't just affect me, they rippled outward, touching millions of lives. When I received reports of new outbreaks, my initial response wasn't just personal, it was public policy. If I showed terror, my advisors would make desperate decisions. If I displayed rage, my generals would seek someone to blame rather than solutions to implement. I learned to treat my emotions like Galen treated symptoms, observing them carefully, understanding their origins, but not allowing them to dictate my prescriptions. When reports arrived describing entire legions decimated by disease, I felt genuine grief for those lost lives. But I couldn't let grief prevent me from redirecting healthy troops to maintain frontier defenses. When citizens demanded I punish the gods for abandoning Rome, I felt their anger and frustration, but I couldn't let popular emotion drive me to waste resources on elaborate sacrifices. Instead of practical medical responses, the plague taught me that emotional control isn't about suppressing feelings. It's about choosing which feelings guide your actions. Galen felt sorrow for every patient he lost, but he channeled that sorrow into determination to save the next one. I felt the weight of every death report, But I transformed that weight into resolve to make decisions that would minimize future suffering during the worst months. When the death toll reached hundreds daily in Rome alone, I established a practice that would serve me for the rest of my reign. Each morning, before meeting with advisors or receiving reports, I would spend 1 hour examining my emotional state. What was I feeling? Why was I feeling it? How might these feelings influence my judgment? What would happen if I acted from these emotions versus acting from reason informed by these emotions? This practice revealed something crucial. Emotions contain vital information, but they're terrible decision makers. My grief over plague deaths told me this crisis mattered immensely, but grief couldn't design effective quarantine procedures. My anger at the disease's unfairness motivated me to fund medical research, but anger couldn't determine which treatments deserved resources. The plague eventually subsided, but its lessons about emotional contagion stayed with me forever. I had learned that controlling my emotions wasn't just personal development, it was imperial responsibility. It was during a brutal winter campaign against the Germanic tribes that I discovered the most powerful concept in all of Stoic philosophy, the inner citadel. We were encamped along the frozen Danube, surrounded by enemies who knew the terrain better than we did, supplied by logistics lines that stretched impossibly thin across hostile territory. Every day brought new challenges. Scouts reported enemy movements. Supply convoys failed to arrive, soldiers suffered from cold and disease, and my generals questioned every strategic decision. The external circumstances were genuinely dire. Faced a real possibility of military disaster, political humiliation, and personal death. Any reasonable assessment of our situation would conclude that we were in serious trouble. Yet it was in this desperate context that I made the most liberating discovery of my life. No external circumstance, no matter how threatening or unpleasant, could touch the essential core of who I was. I began keeping a journal during this campaign, writing by candlelight in my tent after each day's challenges. Initially, these writings were simply attempts to process the stress and uncertainty. But as I wrote, I noticed something remarkable happening. There seemed to be two distinct versions of myself, the emperor who faced external pressures, and the consciousness that observed the emperor facing those pressures. The emperor's self worried about supply lines, felt frustrated by military setbacks, and experienced fear about possible defeat. But the observing self remained curiously untouched by these concerns. It could watch the worry, notice the frustration, and observe the fear without being consumed by any of them. This observing self was like a fortress within a fortress, an inner citadel that no enemy could siege, no circumstance could breach, no external force could conquer. This realization transformed everything. I began to understand that when we say someone makes us angry or a situation causes us stress, we're describing things backwards. External events don't create our emotions. Our judgments about external events create our emotions. The Germanic tribes weren't making me angry. My belief that they shouldn't attack Roman territory was making me angry. The supply problems weren't causing me stress. My attachment to having reliable logistics was causing me stress. Once I grasped this distinction, I started practicing a daily exercise that would become central to my emotional development. Each morning, I would identify the external challenges I expected to face that day, then examine my judgments and attachments related to those challenges. Instead of thinking, I hope the supply convoy arrives safely, I would think the supply convoy may or may not arrive safely, and either outcome will provide an opportunity to practice virtue. This wasn't about becoming passive or fatalistic. I still worked diligently to solve practical problems, still made strategic decisions, still felt appropriate emotions about important events. But I stopped allowing my inner peace to depend on external outcomes. Whether the convoy arrived or didn't arrive, Whether the enemy attacked or retreated, whether the weather favored us or hindered us, none of these circumstances could disturb the inner citadel where my true self resided. The power of this insight became evident during one of the campaign's darkest moments. Enemy forces had surrounded our position, cutting off our retreat route and blocking expected reinforcements. Many of my officers were openly discussing surrender terms, and some soldiers had begun deserting under cover of darkness. By any external measure, we faced potential catastrophe, yet I found myself remarkably calm. Not because I had stopped caring about the outcome, but because I had stopped basing my sense of self on external validation. If we won this battle, I would remain Marcus Aurelius. If we lost, I would remain Marcus Aurelius. If I lived or died, succeeded or failed, was praised or criticized, my essential identity remained unchanged and untouchable. This inner stability allowed me to think more clearly about our tactical situation, communicate more effectively with demoralized troops, and make strategic decisions from reason rather than desperation. When you're not internally fighting external circumstances, you have much more energy available for actually dealing with external circumstances. The inner citadel isn't a place you build, it's a reality you recognize. It was always there, waiting to be discovered. Every person possesses this untouchable core of self that exists independently of external validation or circumstances. The only question is whether you know how to access it when life's storms rage around you. After discovering the inner citadel, I thought I had mastered emotional control. I could observe my feelings, maintain inner peace during external challenges, and lead effectively regardless of circumstances. But there was one area where I still suffered unnecessarily. One source of emotional turbulence I hadn't yet understood: my desires and attachments. The lesson came through personal pain. My son, Lucius Verus, whom I had co-adopted with Antoninus Pius, was leading military campaigns in the East. I had received regular reports of his victories, his growing reputation as a capable general, his success in expanding Roman influence. I was proud of him, pleased by his achievements, and optimistic about his future role in the empire. Then came the message that shattered my composure. Lucius had died suddenly, likely from plague contracted during his eastern campaigns. In an instant, all my plans for shared leadership, all my pride in his accomplishments, all my hopes for his future, everything collapsed into grief and disbelief. For days, I found myself emotionally devastated. Despite all my philosophical training, I had lost emperors, friends, mentors, and soldiers without being destroyed by grief. Why was this different? What had I failed to understand about emotional control? The answer came during a sleepless night when I finally examined my suffering honestly. I hadn't been grief-stricken by Lucius's death. Itself, death is natural and inevitable for all living beings. I was suffering because reality had failed to match my desires. I had wanted him to live, to succeed, to share my reign, to outlive me. My attachment to these specific outcomes, not the actual events, was creating my emotional pain. This realization led me to the most difficult and liberating insight of my philosophical journey: the discipline of desire. Most human suffering comes not from what happens to us, but from the gap between what happens and what we want it to happen. We suffer when reality disappoints our preferences, when circumstances ignore our attachments, when the universe proceeds according to its own logic rather than our personal wishes. I began practicing a radical form of acceptance that transformed my relationship with desire itself. Instead of wanting things to be different from how they are, I trained myself to want things to be exactly as they are. This wasn't passive resignation. I still worked to influence outcomes I could control, but I stopped making my emotional well-being dependent on getting what I wanted. The practice started small. When it rained during outdoor ceremonies, Instead of feeling frustrated that the weather wasn't cooperating, I practiced wanting it to rain. When senators disagreed with my proposals, instead of being annoyed by their opposition, I practiced wanting them to express their honest views. When messengers brought bad news from distant provinces, instead of wishing the news were different, I practiced wanting to receive accurate information about imperial challenges. This discipline extended to my deepest attachments. I loved my remaining children, but I practiced loving them without attachment to their continued existence. I cared about the empire's success, but I practiced caring without attachment to specific outcomes. I valued my own health and life, but I practiced valuing them without clinging to their permanence. This wasn't about becoming cold or indifferent. My love for my children became deeper, not shallower, when it was freed from the anxiety of potential loss. My commitment to the empire became stronger, not weaker, when it was liberated from attachment to particular results. My appreciation for life became more intense, not less, when it was grounded in acceptance rather than grasping. The discipline of desire revealed that freedom isn't about getting what you want. It's about wanting what you get. When you align your desires with reality, instead of demanding that reality align with your desires, you become emotionally unshakable. You can still have preferences, still work toward goals, still feel appropriate emotions about important events, but your inner peace no longer depends on external cooperation. This practice required constant vigilance. Every day brought new opportunities to notice my attachments and practice letting them go. Every disappointment became a chance to choose acceptance over resistance. Every loss became an invitation to love without clinging. The discipline of desire isn't a philosophical theory, it's a daily practice that transforms suffering into strength, attachment into freedom, and emotional reactivity into unshakable peace. One evening, while reviewing reports of a border skirmish that had consumed my attention for weeks, I stepped onto the balcony of my palace and looked up at the stars. The night was clear, and the vastness of the heavens stretched endlessly above Rome. In that moment, something shifted in my perspective that would forever change how I handled daily pressures and emotional turbulence. I began to imagine myself rising above the palace, above the city, above the Italian peninsula. From this elevated viewpoint, the border dispute that had seemed so urgent suddenly appeared as a tiny conflict between groups of people on a small patch of land. Rising higher still, above the Mediterranean, above Europe itself, the entire Roman Empire became just one region on a larger continent. Higher yet, the earth itself became a small sphere floating in infinite space. This wasn't merely an intellectual exercise. It was a profound emotional recalibration. From the cosmic perspective, the urgent crisis that had kept me awake for nights appeared almost comically small, not unimportant, but proportioned correctly within the larger context of existence. The anxiety I had been carrying about this situation simply dissolved when viewed from sufficient height. I made this view from above a regular practice. Whenever I felt overwhelmed by imperial responsibilities, consumed by political pressures, or emotionally reactive to daily challenges, I would perform this mental exercise. I would imagine ascending to increasingly higher altitudes until my current problems found their proper place in the larger scheme of existence. The practice worked because it addressed the fundamental cause of most emotional suffering, taking temporary problems too seriously. When you're completely absorbed in immediate circumstances, everything feels urgent, everything seems permanently important, everything appears capable of determining your ultimate happiness or misery. But when you step back, literally or imaginatively, most daily concerns reveal themselves as temporary fluctuations in an otherwise stable existence. This perspective shift became especially valuable during political crises. Rome's senators were masters of manufactured drama, capable of transforming minor policy disagreements into seeming threats to civilization itself. Before learning the view from above, I would sometimes get caught up in their emotional intensity, feeling that each debate carried enormous stakes for the empire's future. But when I practiced the cosmic perspective, these political theatrics found their proper proportion. Yes, governance mattered. Yes, good policies produced better outcomes than bad ones. But the Republic had survived far worse challenges than any current controversy, and it would likely survive long after all current participants were forgotten. This realization allowed me to engage with political processes more effectively because I wasn't emotionally invested in outcomes beyond my control. The view from above also transformed my relationship with personal slights and criticisms. Romans loved to gossip about their emperor, and unflattering opinions about my policies, my appearance, or my character circulated constantly throughout the city. Early in my reign, I would sometimes feel hurt or angry when these criticisms reached my ears. But from the cosmic perspective, the opinions of specific individuals about my performance seemed appropriately small. Not worthless feedback, contained useful information about my effectiveness, but not devastating either. In a universe containing billions of stars, the disapproval of particular Romans couldn't reasonably determine my emotional state. This practice taught me that emotional overwhelm usually results from tunnel vision. When you focus intensely on immediate problems, they expand to fill your entire field of awareness, creating the illusion that your current challenge is uniquely important and permanently significant. But when you deliberately expand your perspective, present difficulties find their natural size within the larger context of existence. The view from above isn't about minimizing genuine problems or becoming indifferent to important responsibilities. It's about responding to challenges from a place of proportion rather than panic, perspective rather than pressure. When you can see your situation clearly within its larger context, you make better decisions and experience less unnecessary suffering. This cosmic perspective became one of my most reliable tools for emotional regulation, instantly available whenever daily life threatened to overwhelm my equanimity. The most powerful teacher of emotional control is also the most uncomfortable to contemplate: death. Most people spend enormous energy avoiding thoughts of mortality, treating death as a distant abstraction that happens to other people at some indefinite future time. But I learned that regular meditation on death, what the Stoics call memento mori, is one of the most liberating practices for achieving emotional mastery. This lesson came personally when Antoninus Pius, my adoptive father and predecessor, died in my arms. I had watched this strong, capable man who had ruled the empire with wisdom and authority slowly weaken over his final months. His death wasn't sudden or dramatic, it was the natural conclusion of a life fully lived. But witnessing his transition from emperor to corpse taught me truths about existence that no philosophical text could convey. As I sat with his body in those first hours after his death, I was struck by how quickly the man I had revered became simply arranged matter. The authority that had commanded legions, the wisdom that had guided policies, the personality that had shaped my own development, all of it had simply vanished, leaving behind only the physical shell that had housed a remarkable human being. This experience forced me to confront my own mortality in ways I had previously avoided. If death could claim Antoninus, pious, powerful, virtuous, seemingly essential to the empire's functioning, it could certainly claim me. More importantly, it would claim me, and probably sooner than I preferred to imagine. Instead of finding this realization depressing, I discovered it was profoundly liberating. When you truly accept that your time is limited, many sources of emotional turbulence simply lose their power over you. The criticism that had seemed so important yesterday becomes irrelevant when viewed against the backdrop of inevitable death. The achievement you've been desperately pursuing reveals itself as ultimately temporary. The slight someone offered to your dignity appears insignificant when you remember that both you and your critic will be dust within decades. I began incorporating death meditation into my daily routine. Each morning, I would spend time remembering that this day might be my last, that every person I encountered was mortal, that all current concerns would eventually be forgotten. This wasn't morbid dwelling on mortality, was realistic acknowledgement of life's fundamental condition. This practice transformed my emotional responses to daily challenges. When senators criticized my policies, I would remember that we would all be dead within years, and the specific details of our current disagreements would matter to no one. This didn't make me careless about governance. If anything, it made me more focused on what truly mattered. But it prevented me from becoming emotionally devastated by temporary setbacks or interpersonal conflicts. Death consciousness also revealed the foolishness of most anxiety. We worry endlessly about events that might happen, problems that could develop, disasters that may occur. But death is the one future event that will definitely happen, and most people give it no conscious thought. Once you've made peace with the certainty of your own mortality, worrying about uncertain possibilities seems like a waste of precious time. Perhaps most importantly, remembering death taught me to appreciate life more fully. When you know that your time is limited, every experience becomes more vivid, every relationship more precious, every moment more significant. The sunset that you might have ignored becomes beautiful when you remember you'll only see a finite number of sunsets. The conversation that seemed routine becomes meaningful when you realize all conversations will eventually end. This wasn't about becoming obsessed with death, but about letting death teach me how to live. When you accept mortality, you stop postponing happiness, stop delaying important conversations, stop waiting for perfect conditions before appreciating what you already have. Death, as teacher showed me, that emotional control isn't about avoiding difficult realities, it's about embracing the most difficult reality of all, and finding freedom in that acceptance. After years of military campaigns, I had faced Germanic warriors, Sarmatian cavalry, and rebellious provincial governors. I had confronted external enemies who threatened the empire's borders and internal conspirators who challenged imperial authority. But the most dangerous opponent I ever encountered wasn't wielding a sword or commanding an army. It was my own uncontrolled emotional reactions. This revelation came during negotiations with a particularly stubborn tribal chieftain who had been raiding Roman settlements. For weeks, we had exchanged envoys, seeking terms that would end the bloodshed without appearing weak to other potential enemies. The barbarian leader seemed to delight in prolonging discussions, making demands he knew I couldn't accept, then acting offended when I proposed reasonable alternatives. During one especially frustrating session, he made a comment about Roman weakness that triggered something primal in me. I felt rage rising from my chest, my face flushing with heat, my hands clenching into fists. For a moment, I wanted nothing more than to end the negotiations and order his execution. The fury was so intense that I nearly lost control entirely. Fortunately, years of Stoic training kicked in just before I spoke. Instead of reacting immediately, I excused myself from the meeting and walked alone in my tent, trying to understand what had just happened. The chieftain's words were simply sounds in the air. They had no power to harm me unless I gave them that power. Yet my emotional reaction had been so strong that it nearly destroyed weeks of careful diplomacy. That night, I realized I had been thinking about emotional control backwards. I had been treating emotions as external forces that attacked me, requiring defense and resistance. But emotions aren't foreign invaders. They're products of my own mind, generated by my own thoughts and judgments. The enemy wasn't outside, it was within. This insight led me to develop what became my most important daily practice: emotional self-surveillance. Instead of waiting for emotions to overwhelm me and then trying to manage them, I began observing my emotional states continuously. Throughout each day, I learned to notice the early signs of anger before it became rage, to recognize anxiety before it became panic, to identify sadness before it became despair. The key was developing the ability to step outside myself and become a witness to my own emotional experiences. When I felt anger arising, part of my consciousness would step back and observe. Interesting. Marcus is feeling angry right now. What triggered this response? What judgments is he making about this situation? How might this emotion influence his decisions? This observer self wasn't cold or detached, it was compassionately curious about my emotional experience without being controlled by it. It could acknowledge that anger was present without becoming angry itself. It could notice fear without becoming fearful, sadness without becoming sad. The practice required constant vigilance, especially during high-stress situations. In the middle of Senate debates, military briefings, or diplomatic negotiations, I had to maintain dual awareness, engaging fully with external circumstances, while simultaneously monitoring my internal responses. It was like being an actor and the director simultaneously, playing my role while observing the performance. This self-surveillance revealed patterns I had never noticed. I discovered that my anger usually arose when people failed to meet my expectations. My anxiety typically emerged when I tried to control outcomes beyond my influence. And my sadness often came from attachment to things I couldn't keep permanently. Understanding these patterns allowed me to address emotional reactions at their source rather than just managing their symptoms. The enemy within wasn't trying to destroy me. It was trying to protect me using outdated strategies that no longer served my situation. Anger tried to defend against perceived threats. Anxiety attempted to prepare for potential dangers. And sadness mourned losses that mattered to me. The emotions themselves weren't problems. The problem was letting them make decisions without conscious oversight. Once I learned to observe rather than be consumed by my emotions, they became valuable sources of information rather than sources of suffering. My inner enemy became my inner advisor, providing data about my values, concerns, and priorities without dictating my responses to challenging situations. Each day, as Emperor, brought unpredictable challenges, urgent messages from distant provinces, unexpected political crises, personal disappointments that could derail my emotional equilibrium if I wasn't prepared. I learned that emotional control isn't something you achieve once and then maintain effortlessly. It's something you must cultivate fresh each morning through deliberate practice. My daily routine began before dawn, in the quiet hour, when Rome still slept and no urgent matters demanded immediate attention. This wasn't accidental timing, it was strategic preparation for the emotional demands I would face once the day's responsibilities began. I would sit in my private study, facing east toward the rising sun, and spend the first hour of consciousness preparing my mind for whatever challenges lay ahead. The morning preparation had 3 essential components, each designed to strengthen different aspects of emotional resilience. First, I would remind myself of fundamental Stoic principles, reviewing the philosophical foundations that guided my responses to difficult situations. Some people assume this was dry intellectual exercise, but for me it was deeply practical. Like a soldier checking his weapons before battle, I would remind myself that I could control my actions and judgments, but not external events or other people's choices. I would remember that my emotions were products of my thoughts, not inevitable reactions to circumstances. I would recall that virtue was the only true good, that external things like praise or criticism were neither inherently good nor bad, and that death was natural and eventually welcome. Second, I would mentally rehearse the specific challenges I expected to face that day. If I knew I had to meet with particularly difficult senators, I would imagine their likely criticisms and practice responding from reason rather than defensiveness. If I anticipated receiving bad news from military campaigns, I would prepare myself to process that information without becoming overwhelmed by emotions that wouldn't help solve practical problems. This mental rehearsal wasn't about predicting exactly what would happen. That was impossible. It was about preparing my mind to respond thoughtfully rather than reactively to whatever actually occurred. By imagining challenging scenarios in advance, I could practice accessing the calm, rational part of myself before stress made that access more difficult. Third, and most importantly, I would set my intention for the day. Not my goals or objectives, those were practical matters I handled separately. My intention was about the person I wanted to be, regardless of what happened. I would commit to responding to criticism with curiosity rather than anger, to treating setbacks as opportunities for virtue rather than sources of frustration, to maintaining inner peace even if external circumstances became chaotic. This morning practice created what I came to think of as emotional momentum. Just as physical momentum makes it easier to continue moving in the same direction, emotional momentum made it easier to maintain equanimity throughout the day. By starting each morning from a place of calm reflection and philosophical grounding, I built psychological inertia that carried me through later challenges. The preparation also served as a daily reminder of what truly mattered. In the rush of imperial responsibilities, it was easy to lose perspective, to treat temporary problems as permanent crises, to forget that most daily concerns would seem insignificant within years or decades. The morning hour reconnected me with larger purposes and deeper values that provided context for immediate pressures. Perhaps most practically, this routine gave me a reliable refuge during difficult days. No matter how overwhelming circumstances became, I knew that tomorrow morning I would have another opportunity to reset, reflect, and recommit to emotional discipline. This knowledge made temporary emotional disturbances more bearable because I knew they weren't permanent states. The morning preparation wasn't about achieving perfect emotional control. It was about daily practice that gradually strengthened my capacity for wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance, regardless of external circumstances. If morning preparation was about setting intention for the day ahead, evening examination was about learning from the day behind. Each night, after the last meeting had ended and the final reports had been reviewed, I would return to my private chambers and conduct an honest assessment of my emotional responses to the day's events. This wasn't self-criticism or self-congratulation. It was systematic analysis designed to strengthen my emotional discipline over time. The evening examination began with a simple question. When did I respond to situations from emotion rather than reason today? I would review the day's events chronologically, identifying moments when my emotional reactions had influenced my decisions, my words, or my judgment. Sometimes these were obvious instances: anger during a contentious Senate debate, frustration with inefficient bureaucratic processes, anxiety about military reports from distant frontiers. But often the most valuable discoveries came from subtler, emotional influences that I hadn't noticed in the moment. Perhaps I had agreed to a policy proposal not because it was wise, but because disagreeing would have created conflict I wanted to avoid. Maybe I had spoken more harshly to a servant than necessary because I was carrying stress from earlier meetings. These small emotional intrusions were worth examining because they revealed patterns that could grow into larger problems if left unchecked. For each emotional response I identified, I would ask 3 diagnostic questions. What triggered this emotion? What judgment or expectation created my emotional reaction? How might I respond differently to similar situations in the future? This wasn't about condemning myself for having emotions. Emotions are natural and often contain valuable information. It was about understanding how my emotions influenced my choices and whether those influences served wisdom and virtue. The examination also included recognition of emotional victories, moments when I had successfully applied Stoic principles under pressure, when I had received criticism without becoming defensive, accepted bad news without becoming overwhelmed, or maintained composure during particularly challenging negotiations. I would note these successes and try to understand what had enabled them. This positive reinforcement was crucial because emotional discipline requires sustained effort over years. If I only focused on failures and weaknesses, the evening examination would have become a source of discouragement rather than growth. By acknowledging progress and celebrating improvements, I maintained motivation for continued practice. Perhaps most importantly, the evening examination helped me identify specific areas where I needed stronger preparation. If I consistently became frustrated with certain types of people or situations, I could focus my morning mental rehearsal on those particular challenges. If I noticed patterns of anxiety around specific responsibilities, I could develop targeted strategies for managing those concerns. The practice also revealed how interconnected emotional and practical effectiveness were. Days when I maintained better emotional equilibrium were almost always days when I made better decisions, communicated more clearly with advisors, and solved problems more creatively. Conversely, when I allowed emotions to drive my responses, my practical effectiveness suffered along with my inner peace. Over time, the evening examination became a source of genuine wisdom about my own psychology. I learned which situations triggered which emotions, how my emotional state affected my judgment, and what practices most effectively supported my ability to respond thoughtfully rather than reactively to challenging circumstances. This nightly reflection wasn't about achieving perfection, it was about continuous improvement in the art of living according to virtue rather than emotion. Of all the emotions that threatened my ability to rule wisely, anger was the most dangerous. Unlike sadness or fear, which primarily harm the person experiencing them, anger actively destroys relationships, corrupts judgment, and creates lasting damage that extends far beyond the moment of rage. I learned this lesson painfully when my uncontrolled anger nearly destroyed a crucial alliance that had taken years to build. The incident involved a Germanic chieftain named Balthasar, who had been negotiating a peace treaty after months of border conflicts. We were close to an agreement that would have saved thousands of lives and stabilized the entire frontier region. But during our final meeting, he made a casual remark about Roman cowardice that triggered something primal in me. Before I could stop myself, I had risen from my chair, my voice raised in fury, detailing his people's barbarism and Rome's military superiority. For perhaps 3 minutes, I vented years of frustration with barbarian raids, Roman casualties, and the endless cycle of violence along our borders. It felt satisfying in the moment, finally expressing the anger I had been containing throughout months of careful diplomacy. The result was catastrophic. Balthasar stormed out of the negotiations, the peace treaty collapsed, and within weeks we were back to open warfare. Hundreds of soldiers died in battles that could have been avoided if I had controlled my temper for 3 crucial minutes. That experience taught me that anger, no matter how justified it feels, is temporary madness that destroys more than it creates. I began studying anger like a disease, trying to understand its progression and develop effective treatments. I noticed that anger rarely appeared without warning, built gradually through a predictable sequence of thoughts and physical sensations. First came the triggering event, then an immediate judgment about that event, then physical tension in my chest and shoulders, then the overwhelming urge to retaliate or strike back. The key insight was that I had a choice point between the trigger and the explosion, a brief window where I could intervene before anger took complete control. I started practicing what I came to call the 6-second rule. When I felt anger beginning, I would count slowly to 6 before speaking or acting. During those 6 seconds, I would breathe deeply and ask myself one simple question: will responding from anger help solve this problem? The answer was almost always no. Anger might feel powerful and righteous, but it was terrible at actually addressing the underlying issues that triggered it. When advisors brought me bad news, my anger at the messenger didn't improve the news. When senators opposed my policies, my fury at their resistance didn't make my arguments more persuasive. When military campaigns faced setbacks, my rage at circumstances didn't create better strategies. I also discovered that anger was often a secondary emotion masking something else underneath. When I examined my anger carefully, I usually found fear, hurt, or frustration that felt too vulnerable to express directly. It was easier to feel angry at barbarians than to acknowledge my fear about protecting the empire's borders. It was simpler to rage at political opposition than to admit hurt feelings about lack of support for policies I believed were crucial. This understanding led me to develop what became my most effective anger management technique: tracing anger back to its source. When I felt rage rising, I would ask myself, what am I really afraid of? What am I trying to protect? What do I need that I'm not getting? Usually, this investigation revealed legitimate concerns that could be addressed through practical action rather than emotional explosion. The practice of controlling anger also taught me to distinguish between righteous indignation and personal fury. Sometimes anger contained valid information about injustice or wrongdoing that needed to be addressed. But personal anger, the hot, reactive fury that arose when my ego was threatened, was almost always counterproductive. I learned to channel the energy of anger into strategic clarity instead of reactive destruction. When senators betrayed their commitments, instead of exploding at their duplicity, I would use my anger as fuel for developing better accountability systems. When enemies violated treaties, rather than responding with furious retaliation, I would transform my rage into careful planning for more effective deterrence. The ultimate antidote to anger wasn't suppression. It was transformation. By understanding anger's true sources and redirecting its energy toward constructive action, I could maintain both inner peace and outer effectiveness even in situations that would have previously triggered explosive reactions. Fear was perhaps the most seductive of all emotions because it disguised itself as wisdom. While anger was obviously destructive and sadness was clearly painful, fear presented itself as prudent preparation for future dangers. It whispered that it was protecting me from potential disasters, helping me anticipate problems, keeping me vigilant against threats. But I learned that fear was actually one of the most destructive forces in human experience, not because of the dangers it warned about, but because of the imaginary catastrophes it created. This revelation came during my first major military campaign against the Germanic tribes. Intelligence reports suggested we would face a massive coalition of enemy forces, potentially the largest barbarian army ever assembled against Rome. The numbers were genuinely concerning. Our scouts estimated we would be outnumbered nearly 3-1, fighting on unfamiliar terrain, far from reliable supply lines. Fear began as a reasonable caution about legitimate tactical challenges, but gradually it transformed into something more insidious. I found myself lying awake at night, imagining not just military defeat, but complete catastrophe. In my mind, losing this campaign became losing the entire frontier, which became barbarian. Invasions of Italy, which became the fall of Rome itself. Fear had escalated a difficult military situation into an apocalyptic scenario that existed only in my imagination. The most destructive aspect of this fear wasn't the emotional discomfort, it was how it affected my decision-making. Afraid of potential disaster, I became overly cautious in planning, missing opportunities for strategic advantage. Worried about worst-case scenarios, I diverted resources to address threats that might never materialize. Anxious about enemy capabilities, I second-guessed tactical decisions that should have been implemented quickly and decisively. When the actual battle came, reality proved far less dramatic than my fearful imagination had predicted. The enemy coalition was smaller than reported, less organized than anticipated, and their tactics were conventional rather than innovative. We won a decisive victory, but I realized that my fear had been far more dangerous than any external enemy. Fear had been a false prophet, predicting disasters that never occurred while creating real problems through its influence on my judgment. This experience taught me to examine fear with the same skepticism I applied to other emotions. When anxiety arose about potential problems, I began asking, what exactly am I afraid of? How likely is this feared outcome? What evidence supports this concern? What actions can I take to address legitimate risks? Most importantly, am I responding to actual present dangers or imaginary future catastrophes? The investigation usually revealed that fear was operating far beyond the bounds of reasonable caution. Yes, there were always genuine risks that required attention and preparation. But fear wanted to treat every possible negative outcome as an inevitable catastrophe requiring immediate and comprehensive response. Fear was like an advisor who was occasionally right about real dangers, but wrong about everything else, who spoke so loudly and frequently that his rare accuracy was overshadowed by his constant false alarms. I developed a practice I called fear auditing, systematically examining my anxious thoughts to separate legitimate concerns from fears, false prophecies. When I worried about political opposition to my policies, I would ask whether senators actually had the power and motivation to block my agenda, or whether I was imagining resistance that didn't exist. When I felt anxious about military campaigns, I would distinguish between tactical challenges that required planning from apocalyptic scenarios that existed only in my mind. The deepest test of my emotional philosophy came not through external enemies or political crises, but through personal loss that struck at the very core of my identity as a father and human being. Within a span of 3 years, I lost 4 of my children to disease and plague. Each death brought grief so profound that all my Stoic training seemed inadequate against the raw reality of a parent's worst nightmare. The first loss was my daughter Aeneia Galeria Faustina, who died at age 7. Despite my philosophical preparation for the reality of mortality, her death devastated me in ways I hadn't anticipated. The rational part of my mind understood that death was natural, that attachment caused suffering, that I should accept what I couldn't control. But the father in me raged against these abstractions, demanding to know why philosophy offered so little comfort when it was needed most. For weeks after her funeral, I struggled with what felt like a complete failure of my emotional discipline. I found myself angry at the gods, angry at fate, angry at the unfairness of a universe that would take innocent children while leaving corrupt senators to live long lives. The grief was so overwhelming that I questioned whether all my years of Stoic practice had been merely intellectual exercises that crumbled when faced with real suffering. But gradually, as I sat with the pain rather than fighting it, I began to understand something crucial about the relationship between philosophy and grief. Stoicism wasn't supposed to eliminate natural human emotions. It was supposed to prevent unnecessary suffering while allowing appropriate responses to legitimate loss. The death of my daughter was genuinely tragic, and grief was the natural and healthy response to that tragedy. The problem wasn't that I felt grief. The problem would have been if I hadn't felt grief. The love that created the pain was exactly what made my relationship with my daughter meaningful. Trying to eliminate grief would have required eliminating love, which would have made me less human rather than more philosophical. What Stoicism could offer wasn't the absence of pain, but wisdom about which aspects of grief served love and which aspects served only suffering. Missing my daughter, remembering our time together, feeling sad that she wouldn't experience the life I had hoped for her, these were natural expressions of love that honored our relationship, but raging against the inevitability of death, demanding that the universe operate according to my preferences, blaming myself for circumstances beyond my control. These responses added unnecessary suffering to natural grief. I learned to distinguish between grief and self-torture, between mourning and self-destruction. Grief was the price of love, and I was willing to pay that price because the love had been worth it. But I didn't need to compound natural grief with unnatural resistance to reality, with guilt about things I couldn't have prevented, or with anger at circumstances I couldn't control. This understanding transformed how I processed the subsequent deaths of my other children. Each loss brought genuine grief that I allowed myself to feel fully, but I didn't fight the grief or try to eliminate it prematurely. Instead, I learned to grieve, cleanly feeling the full weight of loss, without adding the extra burden of resistance to the way things were. The grief taught me that emotional mastery isn't about becoming invulnerable to pain. It's about experiencing necessary pain without creating unnecessary suffering. Some emotions, like grief for lost loved ones, are the natural cost of caring deeply about people and relationships that matter. The goal isn't to eliminate these emotions, but to experience them with wisdom, allowing them to teach us about love, mortality, and what truly matters in human existence. My children's deaths also taught me that some experiences are so fundamental to human nature that they transcend philosophical systems. No amount of intellectual preparation can fully shield us from the reality of profound loss, but philosophy can help us understand our pain, process it constructively, and find meaning even in experiences we would never choose. Nothing threatened my emotional equilibrium more consistently than the opinions of others. As emperor, I was constantly surrounded by people who praised my wisdom while seeking favors, criticized my policies while positioning themselves for advancement, and offered advice that served their interests rather than the empire's needs. Learning to navigate this sea of others' opinions without losing my inner compass became one of my most crucial emotional skills. The challenge wasn't that people had opinions about my leadership. That was inevitable and often useful. The problem was my unconscious dependence on external validation for my sense of self-worth. When senators praised my policies, I felt pleased and confident. When citizens criticized my decisions, I felt defensive and uncertain. When historians wrote flattering accounts of my reign, I felt pride. When critics questioned my competence, I felt shame. This emotional dependency was exhausting and ultimately pointless. The same action could be praised by some people and condemned by others, sometimes simultaneously. A military campaign that senators called decisive, citizens might call wasteful, while historians might later describe as either brilliant or disastrous, depending on their political perspectives. If my emotional state depended on others' approval, I would be constantly fluctuating between confidence and self-doubt based on the latest opinions I happened to hear. The breakthrough came when I realized that most people's opinions about me were actually opinions about themselves. When senators praised my leadership, they were often really saying that they wanted to be associated with success. When citizens criticized my policies, they were frequently expressing frustration about problems in their own lives that had little to do with imperial governance. When advisors offered conflicting counsel, they were usually advancing their own interests or demonstrating their own expertise rather than providing objective analysis. Understanding this dynamic transformed my relationship with external feedback. Instead of taking others' opinions as accurate assessments of my worth or performance, I began treating them as information about the speaker's needs, fears, desires, and political positions. This shift allowed me to extract useful insights from feedback while maintaining emotional independence from others' judgments. I developed what I came to think of as an internal scorecard based on my own values and standards, rather than external approval. The questions that mattered weren't due. People think I'm a good emperor, but am I acting according to virtue? Am I making decisions based on reason and justice? Am I serving the common good rather than personal interest? These internal measures provided stable criteria for self-evaluation that didn't fluctuate with public opinion. This practice proved especially valuable during periods of unpopular but necessary policies. When I imposed new taxes to fund military campaigns, the decision was deeply unpopular with citizens who preferred lower taxes to frontier security. When I refused to expand gladiatorial games despite public demand, people questioned my understanding of Roman culture. If I had based my decisions on popular approval, I would have made choices that served short-term popularity rather than long-term imperial needs. The internal scorecard also protected me from the opposite problem, becoming addicted to praise and making decisions designed to generate approval rather than achieve good outcomes. When policies proved popular, I had to resist the temptation to repeat similar approaches just because they earned positive feedback. The goal was good governance, not popular acclaim. Perhaps most importantly, I learned that seeking others' approval was ultimately futile because people's opinions were constantly changing based on circumstances beyond my control. The same people who praised me during military victories would criticize me during economic difficulties, regardless of whether my leadership had actually changed. Basing my emotional state on such volatile external factors was like trying to build a house on shifting sand. Others' opinions became like smoke sometimes, useful for indicating which direction the wind was blowing, but never substantial enough to provide reliable foundation for self-worth or decision-making. I could observe them, learn from them when appropriate, but never depend on them for emotional stability. All the emotional control in the world meant nothing if it didn't translate into right action. I had learned to observe my emotions, understand their sources, and maintain inner peace during external challenges. But the ultimate test of emotional mastery wasn't how I felt, it was how I acted when feelings threatened to override reason and virtue. This understanding crystallized during a crisis that demanded immediate, decisive action despite overwhelming emotional pressure. A plague had struck several eastern provinces, killing thousands and threatening to spread throughout the empire. Simultaneously, Germanic tribes were massing for what appeared to be a coordinated invasion across multiple frontier regions. Both crises required my personal attention, but I couldn't be in two places at once. My emotional reactions to this impossible situation were entirely predictable. I felt anxiety about making the wrong choice, guilt about neglecting either crisis, anger at being forced into an unwinnable situation, and fear about the consequences of any decision I might make. Every option seemed to guarantee that people would die because of my choice. But I had learned that emotional turmoil often signaled the need for action based on virtue rather than feeling. Instead of continuing to agonize about the perfect decision, I applied what I had come to call the discipline of action, making the best choice available with current information, implementing it decisively. Capable generals to handle the Germanic threat. This wasn't necessarily the optimal choice. Reasonable arguments could be made for the opposite priority, but it was a virtuous choice based on my assessment of where my presence would make the greatest difference, and once made, I committed to it completely rather than undermining the decision with continued doubt. The discipline of action required distinguishing between perfectionism and excellence. Perfectionism demanded impossible outcomes, saving every life, preventing every problem, making decisions with complete information about unknowable future consequences. Excellence meant doing the best possible job with available resources, information, and circumstances, then accepting that even excellent performance wouldn't prevent all negative outcomes. This distinction proved crucial for maintaining emotional equilibrium during leadership challenges. When my decision to prioritize the plague response resulted in greater losses on the Germanic frontier than might have occurred with my personal presence, perfectionism would have demanded that I blame myself for those deaths. Excellence recognized that some negative outcomes were inevitable regardless of my choice, and that taking responsibility for decisions didn't mean taking responsibility for uncontrollable consequences. The discipline of action also meant acting from principle rather than emotion, even when emotions felt overwhelmingly justified. When a provincial governor betrayed his trust by embezzling funds meant for plague relief, my emotional reaction was fury at his callousness during a humanitarian crisis. The temptation was to make an example of him through harsh punishment that would satisfy my anger and deter similar betrayals. But acting from virtue rather than emotion meant choosing consequences that served justice rather than vengeance, removed him from office, and required restitution of stolen funds, but avoided punishments motivated by my personal anger rather than proportional justice. The goal was effective governance, not emotional satisfaction. Perhaps most importantly, the discipline of action created a feedback loop that strengthened emotional control over time. Each instance of choosing right action despite emotional pressure built confidence in my ability to act from reason rather than feeling. This confidence, in turn, made it easier to remain calm during future crises because I knew I could trust myself to act appropriately regardless of emotional turbulence. The discipline revealed that emotional mastery and practical effectiveness were inseparable. Inner peace without right action was mere self-indulgence, but right action without inner peace was unsustainable under pressure. Together, they created the foundation for leadership that could remain steady and effective even during the most challenging circumstances. The most profound realization of my entire journey toward emotional mastery was also the simplest. All suffering exists in past regret or future anxiety, but peace is always available in the present moment. This insight came to me during one of the darkest periods of my reign, when every direction I looked seemed to contain overwhelming problems, demanding immediate attention. The empire was struggling with plague, military threats, economic disruption, and political instability simultaneously. Each morning brought urgent reports requiring decisions about life and death matters affecting millions of people. My mind constantly raced between analyzing past mistakes that had contributed to current crises and worrying about future catastrophes that might result from present choices. I was physically exhausted, emotionally drained, and mentally scattered across dozens of pressing concerns. Despite all my philosophical training, I felt on the verge of being overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of imperial responsibilities. It was in this state of near desperation that I stumbled upon the most liberating discovery of my philosophical journey. I was sitting in my study late one evening, surrounded by reports I needed to review, letters requiring responses, and strategic decisions that couldn't be postponed. My mind was spinning between regret about strategic choices I had made months earlier and anxiety about problems that might develop weeks in the future. I felt completely unable to focus on any single task because my attention was fragmented across past and future concerns. Then something shifted. Instead of continuing to struggle with this mental chaos, I simply stopped and asked myself, what is actually happening right now, in this exact moment? The answer was remarkably simple. I was sitting in a comfortable chair, in a warm room, with adequate food and water available. I was physically safe, intellectually capable, and surrounded by advisors who could help implement whatever decisions I made. In that specific moment, there was no crisis. There were potential future problems and past mistakes, but in the immediate present, I was simply a human being sitting in a room, breathing air, alive and capable of thought. All the overwhelming pressure I was experiencing existed in my mental projections about other times and places, not in my actual current experience. This realization led me to develop what became my most practical daily technique for emotional regulation, present moment anchoring. Whenever I felt overwhelmed by the scope of imperial responsibilities, I would deliberately return my attention to immediate physical reality. What could I see, hear, feel, taste, or smell right now? What was my body actually experiencing in this specific moment? The practice worked because it revealed that overwhelming feelings almost always came from thinking about multiple problems simultaneously, usually problems that existed in different time periods. When I focused on one challenge at a time, in the context of what I could actually do about it today, most situations became manageable. The sense of being overwhelmed came from trying to solve everything at once, rather than addressing one issue at a time. Present moment awareness also revealed how much mental energy I was wasting on things beyond my current control. When I received reports about problems in distant provinces, my mind would immediately jump to worst-case scenarios about how those problems might develop over coming months. But those future scenarios didn't exist yet, and my anxiety about them didn't help me respond effectively to current realities. I learned to distinguish between productive planning and unproductive worrying. Planning involved using current information to prepare for likely future scenarios through concrete actions I could take today. Worrying involved imagining catastrophic outcomes and feeling anxious about them without taking any constructive steps to address actual problems. The present moment became my refuge during the most challenging periods of leadership. No matter how complex the empire's problems appeared when viewed comprehensively, there was always something specific and manageable I could do right now. I could read one report, make one decision, have one conversation, or take one action that moved us in a positive direction. This focus on immediate reality also enhanced the quality of my decision-making. When I approach problems from a state of present moment, clarity rather than anxiety about past and future, I could think more clearly, see options more accurately, and choose responses more wisely. The present moment contained all the power. I actually possessed to influence outcomes. As my reign drew toward its end, and I contemplated what I would leave behind, I realized that the most valuable legacy I could offer wasn't military victories, architectural monuments, or territorial expansions. Those achievements would eventually crumble, be forgotten, or be surpassed by future leaders. The legacy that could endure indefinitely was the demonstration that human beings can achieve mastery over their emotional reactions regardless of external circumstances. This understanding came to me during my final military campaign along the Danube frontier. I was approaching 60 years old. My health was declining, and I knew this would likely be my last opportunity to secure the empire's northern borders. The campaign was grinding and difficult, marked more by slow progress than dramatic victories. As I sat in my tent one evening, writing what would become part of my meditations, I reflected on what had truly mattered during my years as emperor. The military campaigns would be remembered for a while, but other emperors would fight different wars that might overshadow my achievements. The buildings I had constructed would eventually decay or be demolished to make room for newer structures. The laws I had enacted would be modified or repealed as circumstances changed. Even the Roman Empire itself wouldn't last forever, no human institution ever had. But the example of emotional self-mastery could potentially inspire people for centuries, maybe millennia. If I could demonstrate that even someone bearing ultimate responsibility for millions of lives could maintain inner peace, make decisions from reason rather than emotion, and respond to crises with virtue rather than reactivity, then perhaps others facing smaller challenges could find courage to master their own emotional responses. This legacy wouldn't require monuments or inscriptions. It would live in the minds and hearts of people who learned that external circumstances don't determine internal experience, that suffering is optional even when pain is unavoidable, that virtue is possible regardless of how chaotic the world becomes. I had seen this ripple effect already beginning during my lifetime. Advisors who had observed my approach to emotional challenges started applying similar principles in their own lives. Generals who had watched me respond calmly to military setbacks began developing their own practices for maintaining composure under pressure. Citizens who had heard about my philosophical approach to leadership started asking questions about Stoic principles and how they might apply such ideas to their personal difficulties. The legacy of self-mastery was unique because it was simultaneously practical and transcendent. Unlike other achievements that required specific resources, circumstances, or talents, emotional control was available to anyone willing to practice the necessary disciplines. A slave could achieve the same inner freedom that I had developed as emperor. A merchant could learn the same techniques for managing anxiety that helped me govern an empire. A parent could apply the same principles for controlling anger that I used during political crises. This universal accessibility made emotional mastery the most democratic form of human achievement. While not everyone could become emperor, lead armies, or build lasting institutions, everyone could become sovereign over their own inner experience. Everyone could choose virtue over vice, reason over emotion, wisdom over reactivity. Perhaps most importantly, the legacy of self-mastery was self-perpetuating. Unlike material achievements that required maintenance and protection, emotional wisdom grew stronger when shared. Each person who learned to control their emotions became a teacher for others simply through their example of remaining calm during difficulties, responding thoughtfully rather than reactively to challenges, and maintaining inner peace regardless of external turbulence. This was the legacy I wanted to leave, proof that human beings need not be victims of their emotional reactions, that inner freedom is possible under any circumstances, and that the highest achievement of any life is learning to govern oneself with wisdom, courage, justice, and self-discipline. Now, you possess the same knowledge that guided me through nearly 2 decades of ruling the most powerful empire in the world while maintaining inner peace amid chaos. The principles I've shared aren't theoretical concepts. They are practical tools tested under the most extreme pressures imaginable. But knowledge alone changes nothing. These insights will remain mere intellectual curiosities unless you claim sovereignty over your own emotional kingdom. You don't need imperial authority to practice emotional mastery. You don't need perfect circumstances or ideal conditions. You don't need to wait until you feel ready or until life becomes less challenging. The crown of self-mastery is available to you right now, exactly where you are, regardless of your current situation. Begin with the morning preparation. Tomorrow, wake 15 minutes earlier than usual and spend that time setting your intention. For the day, review the Stoic principles we've discussed. Mentally rehearse how you want to respond to likely challenges. Commit to approaching the day with virtue rather than reactivity. This simple practice will create emotional momentum that carries you through difficult moments. Implement the evening examination. Before sleep, review your emotional responses to the day's events. When did you react from emotion rather than reason? What triggered those responses? How might you handle similar situations differently? What moments of emotional control can you celebrate? This nightly reflection will accelerate your progress in developing self-mastery. Practice the inner citadel during daily challenges. When external circumstances threaten your peace of mind, remember that no event can disturb your essential self without your consent. You can observe your emotions without being controlled by them. You can acknowledge difficult feelings without allowing them to dictate your actions. Your inner core remains untouchable regardless of external turbulence. Master the discipline of desire by accepting what you cannot control while working diligently on what you can influence. Stop demanding that reality conform to your preferences. Practice wanting what happens rather than happening to get what you want. This doesn't mean becoming passive, it means becoming free from attachment to specific outcomes while still pursuing worthy goals. Apply the view from above when daily problems seem overwhelming. Step back mentally and see your current challenges within their larger context. Most situations that feel enormous today will seem insignificant within months or years. This cosmic perspective will restore proportion to problems that temporary circumstances have inflated beyond their actual importance. Use death as a teacher for appreciating life more fully. Remember that your time is limited, that everyone you encounter is mortal, that all current concerns will eventually be forgotten. This awareness will help you focus on what truly matters while releasing attachment to temporary frustrations and disappointments. Transform anger into strategic clarity by pausing before reacting to provocations. Count to 6, breathe deeply, and ask whether responding from anger will help solve the underlying problem. Channel the energy of anger into constructive action rather than destructive reaction. Remember that anger is temporary madness that creates more problems than it solves. Audit your fears by distinguishing between legitimate concerns and imaginary catastrophes. Most anxiety comes from projection rather than present reality. Address actual risks through appropriate preparation while refusing to be paralyzed by scenarios that exist only in your imagination. Process grief cleanly by feeling natural sorrow without adding unnecessary suffering. Loss and mourning are the price of love, and that price is worth paying. But don't compound inevitable grief with resistance to reality. Guilt about things beyond your control, or anger at circumstances you cannot change. Treat others' opinions as information about the speakers, rather than accurate assessments of your worth. Develop an internal scorecard based on virtue rather than external validation. Make decisions that serve long-term good rather than short-term popularity. Practice the discipline of action by choosing virtue over emotion when feelings conflict with wisdom. Act from principle rather than impulse. Excellence rather than perfectionism. Justice rather than vengeance. Let right action strengthen emotional control, and let emotional control enable right action. Anchor yourself in present moment awareness when past regrets or future anxieties threaten to overwhelm you. All your actual power exists in the current moment. Past mistakes cannot be changed. Future problems don't exist yet, but you can always choose virtue right now. These aren't just techniques for managing stress or improving performance. They are the foundation for a completely different way of experiencing life. When you master your emotions, you become free in the deepest sense possible. External circumstances lose their power to determine your inner state. You can maintain peace during chaos, clarity during confusion, courage during danger. You become emperor of your inner world, sovereign over your own experience, master of your own destiny. This is the crown I offer you, not made of gold or adorned with jewels, but forged from wisdom, courage, justice, and self-discipline. It cannot be taken from you by force, diminished by criticism, or destroyed by circumstances. Claim it today. Begin your reign over the only kingdom that truly belongs to you, your own mind and heart. The empire of the self awaits your leadership.